According to our sources, the international community has entered a rare moment of cautious optimism. After months of intense fighting, humanitarian disasters, and diplomatic deadlock, a fragile peace agreement has reportedly been reached in Gaza. Officials in the region frame it as a necessary pause for stability, while in expert circles the conversation is more careful. This may be the first step toward a broader political settlement, or it may simply be a temporary intermission in a cycle of violence that has defined the area for decades. Analysts emphasize that the global financial and political impact of this deal is already being felt. Observers note that the agreement did not come out of nowhere. Behind closed doors, negotiators from regional powers, Western governments, and international organizations worked for weeks, stitching together a compromise that addresses immediate humanitarian needs while leaving larger political questions unresolved. The text of the agreement focuses on halting large-scale hostilities, opening humanitarian corridors, and restoring basic services. But experts warn, the absence of clarity on long-term governance, security guarantees, and regional recognition means the foundations of this peace remain fragile. In financial markets, the reaction was swift. Oil prices dipped slightly, reflecting reduced fears of supply disruptions in the eastern Mediterranean, while regional equity indices posted modest gains. Yet, according to market analysts, the optimism remains restrained. Traders, insurers, and energy companies continue to factor in the possibility that the truce could collapse if trust between the parties is broken. Analysts underline that the region's history is full of agreements that have dissolved as quickly as they were signed. Diplomatic sources point out that the peace deal is heavily dependent on the willingness of external actors to provide guarantees. Egypt and Qatar played crucial roles in facilitating dialogue, while Washington and Brussels exerted pressure to move negotiations forward. In expert circles, there is quiet recognition that such heavy reliance on external mediation leaves the process vulnerable. Should international attention shift or donor fatigue set in, the momentum could evaporate. At the same time, the humanitarian dimension cannot be overstated. For civilians in Gaza, even a fragile ceasefire represents a temporary relief from bombardments, shortages, and uncertainty. Humanitarian organizations cautiously welcomed the agreement, while noting that aid convoys, reconstruction efforts, and the restoration of utilities will require consistent security guarantees. Experts emphasize that a pause in violence is not enough. Without structural rebuilding, frustration and instability will soon return. From a geopolitical perspective, the peace agreement creates both opportunities and risks. Regional powers may use the truce as a platform to push for new alignments, while others may see it as a chance to advance their own strategic agendas. Observers underline that the interplay between local actors and international sponsors will define the durability of this fragile arrangement. This agreement may not resolve decades of conflict, but it signals a shift in momentum, and financial markets, governments, and societies are watching closely. Subscribe to the channel to stay ahead of the developments shaping not only the Middle East, but the global economic order connected to it. According to our sources, the peace agreement is already reshaping the regional diplomatic landscape. In Cairo, Ankara, and Riyadh, senior officials cautiously framed the ceasefire as an opportunity window, while in Washington and Brussels the language was more guarded, emphasizing verification and monitoring. Analysts in international policy forums underline that the strength of this agreement lies not in its paper provisions, but in the credibility of enforcement mechanisms, which at this stage remain vague. Observers note that, for Israel, the deal provides temporary respite from international criticism and allows political leaders to claim diplomatic progress without conceding core security demands. For Palestinian factions, the truce offers breathing space to regroup politically, repair networks of civilian governance, and demonstrate to the population that external pressure can produce tangible relief. Yet, experts warn, this delicate balance is unstable. Both sides are under domestic pressures that may test the truce sooner rather than later. In financial terms, investors are recalibrating their exposure to the region. Shipping companies that had rerouted traffic around the eastern Mediterranean are cautiously returning to normal routes. Insurers are adjusting premiums, and energy markets are recalculating supply risks. Analysts point out, however, that confidence remains tentative. History shows that markets tend to overreact to headlines of peace and underprice the probability of renewed escalation. For now, the consensus is that volatility will remain elevated. Diplomatic insiders emphasize the pivotal role of guarantors. Egypt has offered to host a monitoring mission, Qatar has pledged financial aid for reconstruction, and the United Nations has proposed a framework for humanitarian coordination. Yet, experts underline that none of these guarantees are binding. Without clear accountability, each party retains wide discretion, which could undermine the ceasefire's longevity. In expert circles, this is described as the fragility paradox. The agreement exists because no one can afford a wider war, yet its survival depends on the very actors who benefit from ambiguity. Humanitarian organizations are cautiously optimistic. According to their initial assessments, access to Gaza's border crossings has slightly improved, and aid flows have resumed. However, observers stress that logistical challenges remain immense. Power shortages, damaged infrastructure, and shortages of basic medical supplies will require months, if not years, to address. In expert reports, the phrase ceasefire fatigue already appears, a warning that donors may grow weary if immediate improvements for civilians are not visible. Social dynamics within Gaza also merit attention. Analysts note that the population, exhausted by cycles of conflict, greets the truce with relief, but also with skepticism. Surveys conducted by independent monitors indicate a mix of cautious hope and deep mistrust. Observers underline that this psychological factor is critical. Without trust in political leadership, the ceasefire risks collapsing under the weight of internal discontent. From a regional security perspective, the truce alters calculations. Neighboring states such as Jordan and Lebanon are closely monitoring developments, wary of spillover effects. In Tel Aviv, military planners are recalibrating deployment schedules, while in Tehran, the ceasefire is framed as evidence of resilience and resistance. Analysts emphasize that the truce does not end regional rivalries, it simply freezes them in place. The peace agreement has shifted the tone of international discussion, but whether it signals a sustainable pathway or a temporary pause remains an open question. According to our sources, the current ceasefire in Gaza is being described by experts as a stress test for the entire region. Analysts emphasize that what happens in the next few weeks will determine whether the agreement is remembered as a breakthrough or as yet another short-lived truce in a long history of failed accords. The stakes are high, not only for the parties directly involved, but also for the regional order and the global economy. Observers highlight that one of the most pressing challenges is the question of governance. The ceasefire framework outlines provisions for humanitarian access and basic security coordination, but it avoids addressing the deeper issues of political authority, territorial control, and long-term sovereignty. In expert circles, there is a cautious recognition that leaving these matters unresolved may buy temporary stability, but at the cost of building pressure for the future. As one senior analyst noted, a truce without political architecture is a bridge to nowhere. Financial markets continue to mirror this uncertainty. While oil prices stabilized in the immediate aftermath of the announcement, volatility remains elevated. Investors are hedging against sudden reversals, and insurers are writing contracts that assume periodic disruptions. Economists underline that global markets are deeply interconnected with Middle Eastern geopolitics. A supply chain disturbance in Gaza or a spike in regional tensions can ripple across energy, logistics, and manufacturing sectors worldwide. Diplomatic sources stress that the international community is now walking a tightrope. On the one hand, there is clear interest in consolidating the truce. On the other hand, external actors remain wary of overcommitment. The European Union, for instance, has pledged humanitarian funding but hesitated to expand security guarantees. Washington has voiced support but refrained from announcing a long-term strategy. In expert assessments, this reflects a pattern of managed engagement, where powers seek influence without assuming full responsibility. Humanitarian organizations caution that time is not on the side of stability. Civilian infrastructure in Gaza remains severely degraded. Water systems, hospitals, and schools are only partially operational, and reconstruction requires both money and guarantees of safety. Observers warn that if ordinary people see little improvement in daily life, frustration will mount, undermining the fragile calm. Regional actors also shape the trajectory of this agreement. Cairo views the truce as an opportunity to reinforce its role as mediator. Doha presents itself as a patron of reconstruction, while Tehran and Ankara watch for openings to expand their influence. Experts underline that these competing agendas can either support or sabotage the ceasefire, depending on how carefully they are managed. Ultimately, the peace agreement in Gaza represents a fragile equilibrium of interests, fears, and hopes. It is a moment of respite, not a final resolution. Analysts stress that the ability of local and international actors to navigate this moment will decide whether the ceasefire becomes a foundation for dialogue or another footnote in a cycle of conflict. For those following the financial and political dimensions of this fragile peace, staying informed is essential. Subscribe to the channel to understand how developments in Gaza affect not just the Middle East, but the stability of global markets and the security landscape shaping tomorrow's world. According to our sources, the current truce in Gaza is beginning to expose the deeper structural challenges that threaten its durability. Experts underline that while the immediate cessation of hostilities has created relief on the ground, the absence of a binding enforcement mechanism raises the risk of collapse. Observers stress that each side continues to interpret the agreement through its own political lens, creating a fragile equilibrium that could unravel under pressure. Military analysts highlight that although large-scale operations have paused, localized incidents continue. Skirmishes, arrests, and sporadic rocket launches have been reported, and while officially dismissed as isolated, they test the limits of restraint. In expert discussions, this is described as the gray zone of ceasefires, actions that do not formally break the truce, but steadily erode trust. The longer this pattern continues, the harder it becomes to sustain momentum toward broader peace. From a financial perspective, the truce remains a mixed signal. Energy markets, initially calmed by news of the agreement, are still pricing in significant risk premiums. Shipping insurers, wary of renewed instability, have kept elevated rates for cargo passing through regional corridors. Analysts underline that this illustrates the paradox of fragile peace. Even when guns fall silent, markets anticipate their return. Diplomatic sources report that external guarantors are increasingly concerned with maintaining credibility. Egypt, Qatar, and the United Nations have positioned themselves as key facilitators, yet each faces constraints. Cairo struggles with domestic economic pressures, Doha must balance its regional ambitions with global scrutiny, and the UN's capacity is limited by member states' competing agendas. Experts warn that if guarantors cannot project confidence, parties on the ground will have little incentive to honor the terms of the ceasefire. Humanitarian conditions remain precarious. Aid organizations have noted improved access to certain areas, but reconstruction is minimal, and essential supplies remain scarce. Observers emphasize that civilian patience is finite. If people see no tangible improvement, resentment can quickly resurface. In expert reports, this is often cited as a recurring flaw of past ceasefires, the failure to translate diplomatic breakthroughs into visible benefits for ordinary lives. Regionally, the agreement has prompted strategic recalculations. Israel views the pause as a chance to reassess military priorities, while Palestinian factions use the lull to consolidate political capital. In Tehran and Ankara, officials frame the ceasefire as evidence of shifting balances of power, even as they prepare for possible future escalations. Analysts underline that regional rivalries remain intact, simply suspended under the shadow of temporary peace. In international financial hubs, investors are monitoring signals of stability with skepticism. Capital flows have not fully returned, and major development projects remain on hold. Economists stress that markets respond not to announcements, but to demonstrated patterns of calm. Without at least several months of sustained peace, large-scale investment is unlikely to materialize. In expert circles, the consensus is cautious. The ceasefire is a milestone, but not a solution. Its endurance depends on addressing unresolved political questions and on the ability of guarantors to maintain pressure on both parties. Without that, the current agreement may follow the trajectory of many before it, a temporary pause overshadowed by inevitable relapse into conflict. According to our sources, international analysts are now describing the Gaza peace agreement as both an opportunity and a warning. It is an opportunity because, for the first time in months, diplomacy has managed to silence weapons long enough to create humanitarian space. It is a warning because the fragility of this truce underlines how easily the region can be pulled back into confrontation. Experts emphasize that the durability of this ceasefire will depend less on what is written in communiques and more on whether tangible improvements appear on the ground. Observers point out that history is full of ceasefires in Gaza that collapsed within weeks. Skeptics argue that without a framework for addressing deeper political questions, recognition, sovereignty, and security guarantees, this deal may follow the same path. Supporters counter that even temporary pauses are valuable, allowing aid to flow, civilians to recover, and international actors to re-engage. Analysts underline that this tension between pragmatism and pessimism defines the current moment. From an economic perspective, the peace agreement offers mixed signals. Short-term relief in energy markets has been noted, but the persistence of elevated risk premiums indicates that investors remain unconvinced. Financial institutions continue to price in instability, reflecting a view that the truce could collapse at any moment. Economists stress that without sustained calm, capital will remain cautious. Insurers will demand higher costs, and development initiatives will be delayed. Diplomatic sources note that guarantors face their own balancing act. Egypt seeks to showcase its role as regional mediator. Qatar aims to leverage reconstruction aid as political capital, and Western governments weigh the benefits of involvement against the risks of failure. In expert circles, the prevailing view is that the success or collapse of this agreement will redefine the credibility of all mediators involved. Humanitarian voices are clear. The ceasefire must deliver visible benefits to the population. Aid convoys, restoration of utilities, and rebuilding of infrastructure are urgent priorities. Observers warn that if civilians experience the truce only as a pause without progress, disillusionment will set in quickly. Analysts emphasize that the legitimacy of peace agreements depends not on diplomatic statements, but on the daily lives of ordinary people. Regionally, the implications are profound. The ceasefire recalibrates relationships among neighbors, creates new openings for rival powers, and shapes the narratives used by political leaders. In Tehran, Ankara, and Riyadh, officials carefully frame their positions, each seeking to demonstrate influence without direct entanglement. Experts underline that the Middle East's strategic balance remains volatile, and the Gaza agreement, while fragile, is now one of the central variables. The overarching conclusion from expert discussions is sobering. This peace agreement is not a resolution, but a temporary alignment of interests. Its survival depends on whether local actors, regional powers, and international guarantors can maintain their overlapping incentives long enough to turn a truce into a process. For viewers who want to understand how fragile ceasefires influence not only regional politics, but also the stability of global markets, staying informed is crucial. Subscribe to the channel to follow how this peace in Gaza evolves, whether it becomes a stepping stone toward broader dialogue or just another fragile pause in an endless cycle of conflict.